Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be going over the Sprite Asset Creation process in TextMesh Pro, as well as explaining the Sprite Asset itself and its functionality. Then we'll be going over the Sprite tag, which enables you to add graphics or sprites in line with your text objects. So let's begin by taking a look at how we can create our Sprite assets. To create your sprite asset, you will first need to import a texture in Unity that contains your sprites. So in this case, I've imported this social icons texture, which if I select to bring up the sprite editor in Unity, we can see that this texture contains several sprites. Now I've defined these sprites by using the slice function in the sprite editor. Now once this step is done, we're ready to create our sprite asset, and to do so, I will select my texture, right click on it to bring up the context menu, choose create, and then go to the TextMesh Pro sprite asset. Once this is done, we can see that our sprite asset has been created. If I select it, it brings up the Sprite Asset Inspector panel, and next we're going to go over these different options and the information contained in the sprite asset. Looking at the sprite asset, we can see that it contains a reference to the texture that contains our sprites. It also contains a reference to a material that is using the TextMesh Pro sprite shader, and this material also references this same texture. Next, we can see a list of all the different sprites contained in our sprite asset, and this list is broken up in 2 pages, which we can navigate through by using the Next and Previous button. Now, since some sprite assets may contain hundreds of sprites, to make it more efficient to navigate through these pages, if you hold down the Shift key, it will move up 10 pages. In this case, we've only got 9, so it will move up to the end of the list. And if I hit Shift and Previous, it will bring us back to the first page. Next, we're going to take a look at the individual sprites themselves, and I'll explain what all the information contained in each sprite means. Looking at the sprites, the ID is what you'll be using when you're trying to reference a sprite using the sprite tag with the index attribute. The name is what you'll be using when you're trying to reference a sprite by name using the name attribute of the sprite tag. The name is case sensitive, so it's important to remember that. When the sprites were defined using the sprite editor in Unity, a name was automatically assigned to them. You can select the individual sprites and change their name to something that would be easier for you to recall which is which. The X and Y represent the position of the sprite in the texture itself. Then you have the width and the height of the sprite. Then you have the X and Y offset, and these are relative to the pivot that was used when the sprite was defined. Now these are important, as adjusting them will adjust the position of the sprite relative to the baseline of the text. The advance defines how much space a sprite will take. Now, since each sprite is likely to have a different size, it's important that they still get scaled correctly based on the font and the point size that you're using. So every single sprite, regardless of their real width and height, will be scaled to the baseline up to the ascender of the text. So they're basically normalized that way. So the height is adjusted between baseline and ascender, and the width is basically kept at the same aspect ratio. So at a scale factor of 1, they will always match from baseline to ascender. Now by changing the scale factor, it allows you to adjust the relative size of individual sprites to the text itself. Now next, we're going to be taking a look at the sprite tag itself, and we'll be coming back inside the Sprite Asset Editor to make changes to these different properties. We will also take a look at the global offsets and scale. Next, I will be creating a new text object so we can take a look at our sprite tag. But before I do so, I have to cover another important detail, which is since we're going to need to load these sprite assets at runtime, they have to be located inside of a resources folder that is located inside of your Unity project. More specifically, in order for TextMesh Pro to find these sprite assets, and in order to keep things organized, these sprite assets have to be located inside of a sprites folder that is contained inside of a resource folder. So here I'm going to move my sprite asset from my sprites folder into the resources and sub sprites folder. Now, in the current release of TextMesh Pro and previous releases, this is how it had to be. And in terms of the current release, we're talking about TextMesh Pro release 0.1.54 beta 3b. But in the next release, since having this sprites folder and other sprites folder can be confusing, whereby this actually contains a sprite asset, so having this called sprites can lead to confusion. In the next release of TextMesh Pro, you'll be able to go in the TMP settings file. And in this TMP settings file, you'll be able to change the location where TextMesh Pro looks into to find these sprite assets. And since in this case we are talking about sprite assets, instead of having them located inside of a resource folder and into a sprite subfolder, I think it makes more sense for them in the future to be contained inside of a sprite assets subfolder. So if I made this change, I would have to come here and rename this Sprite Assets. And now TextMesh Pro would be able to successfully locate these Sprite Assets here, and this leads to better organization. But if you don't like Sprite Assets and you want to call it whatever you want, you'll be able to make the change here. So having said all of that, let's move on to our next step, create our text object, and finally take a look at our Sprite tag. Before creating my new text object, I will quickly disable this current one. Now, as you may already know, there are two text components available in TextMesh Pro. There is one which I call the normal TextMesh Pro component, which works with the mesh renderer, and it replaces the old text mesh. And to create a new text object that uses the normal TextMesh Pro component, you would go to Create, 3D Object, and you would select TextMesh Pro here. But for this example, I'm going to be using a new text object that's working with the Canvas system. And to do so, I can go to Create, UI, and basically select TextMesh Pro right here. Now the Sprite tag works with either TextMesh Pro components. So first I'm going to scale my rect transform just so I can make the text bigger. I will change the point size to something bigger as well so you can see everything clearly. And we're going to type away. So I'm going to say A, and then I will use the Sprite tag. So Sprite, and I will go equal 0. So when I say Sprite equals 0, it will bring up the Sprite at index or ID 0. Now, what I just typed, the same thing would be saying Sprite space index equal 0. Now, where does this smiley face come from? Because the sprite asset we were working with, this social icons, did not have a smiley face in it. So by default, TextMesh Pro includes a default sprite asset, and this default sprite asset is located inside of the resource folder here, inside of this sprites asset folder. So this is the default sprite asset that TextMesh Pro uses, where you can see here the smiley face at ID 0 that I just brought up. And it's actually called smiley, so just for testing purposes, let's go back to our text object and show. So here I'm using the sprite tag with the index attribute. I could use the sprite tag with the name attribute, and names have to be in quote, or in quotes. So in this case, it's called smiley, and now we can see that we're referencing smiley by name itself. Now, this is the default sprite asset. Well, what if you don't want to use this one? Well, in the TMP settings file, which I covered previously, you can go in there and define what the default sprite asset is. So in this case, the default sprite asset is this current one that we're using. But if I wanted it to be our social icons or anything else, I could simply select it and it would use it automatically. Now, here if we look at our screen, it says a sprite named Smiley. Well, our social icons sprite asset does not contain a sprite named Smiley. So when TextMesh Pro is unable to locate the sprite or anything, for example at index 0 or at a specific name, it will display the tag without consuming it, meaning without it going away. So in this case, since there is no smiley, let's just use the index instead. So we're going to say we're looking for sprite at index equals 0. Whoops. I have to make sure I type it right, and we have a quote here, which I'll make go away. And here we can see that as we changed our default sprite asset, it is now using this other one that we've defined in the TMP settings file. But let's go back and fix or reset our TMP settings file so it's using the default one. And as I change it back to this one, you will see that our smiley face comes back. So the next logical question is, okay, well, how do I access individual sprite assets? Well, that's pretty simple. So we've covered already sprite space index equal whatever index, or sprite space name equal whatever name of the sprite. So how do I reference a different sprite asset? Well, you do so by using sprite equal in quote. Again, it is case sensitive. So we know that this new sprite asset, we called it social icons, close the quotes, equal, then we want to access it by index. So I'm going to go index equals 0. So now the sprite tag, when we define equal something, this sprite equal references the sprite asset itself. And then we can reference it by index or by name. So right now, I can't recall what the name of that first sprite was. So let's actually navigate to our sprite asset, go there, and give this first one that's right here a relevant name that I will be able to remember, and we'll call it sprite1. See, magical, difficult name. So I'm going to go back here just for testing purposes again, just to make sure it works. So I'm going to say I'm looking for the sprite in my social icons sprite asset. I'm looking for the one named sprite1, and close quotes. Now, it still kind of works if you don't use the quotes, but things can get tripped up. So always use quotes when you're referencing names of sprite assets or the names of the sprites themselves. So even though it works sometimes without the quotes, it can get tripped up. So just use the quotes for sure. Okay, so now we have our sprite and we know how to access the sprite, and I'm going to go AA and put an A behind it. Now, as you can see, our friend the sprite is kind of not lined up correctly, right? It's misaligned based on where our text is. So let's go back to our social icon and cover how we can adjust the position of our sprite as I described it before. As I mentioned previously, the X offset and Y offset determine the position of the sprite relative to the text. Now, if I was to open the sprite editor, we would see that the pivot point of this sprite is sitting right in the middle, which happens to be exactly where this sprite ended up being positioned relative to the advance or origin of the next character. So right now this part of the A is hidden behind the sprite, but you can see how the pivot is located roughly where my cursor is, and then this is where the sprite is drawn on top of it. Right? So when you're defining the sprites in the sprite editor in Unity, know that the pivot would affect where the sprite shows up initially. So if the pivot had been set up here, the character would have been drawn basically from this point, going that way. Now, do I worry about that when I'm defining my sprites and creating sprite assets? No, I do not. Why? Because I can manually go in and change that value, and then manually go in and change the vertical offset of my sprite. So I'm going to just set the value to 115 to some kind of nice round number. So this is how you would control and adjust the position of the individual sprite relative to your text. The advance is basically just to show what it is exactly. The advance, the 128, is computed from this origin point going this way, and we have 128, and it determines where the next character or sprite would be inserted. Now by default it's always going to be the same as the width, but know that you can override that and change it to whatever you want. Now the scale factor is the next thing we need to cover. Like I mentioned, the sprites can vary in size, and they're always going to be scaled to go from baseline to ascender. And this ascender, if I was to select the current font asset that I'm using. So if I go here and I'm using Aerial SDF and I go to Aerial SDF, you'll see that the ascender is at 76.93 times whatever the point size and whatever stuff. But this is where the ascender is defined. So if I was to actually have, hopefully I won't have to redo this part of my video, but if I was to tweak this ascender here, you'll see how it's actually affecting our sprite, because the sprite is at scale factor of 1. It's adjusted based on where the baseline and the ascender of the font is. And this scaling always occurs based on the font asset that is assigned to the text object. So as you know, in TextMesh Pro, you can use multiple fonts per text object. Well, regardless of what font is being used, the scaling of the sprites, in order to ensure consistency and predictable results, it's always going to be based on the font asset that is assigned to the object itself and not the other ones that you might be using. Okay, so let's go back to our sprite asset and continue playing with the scaling, just so I can show it. So my mouse is ultra sensitive, so I will try to not go nuts, and I just did. So here I'll show how by changing the scale factor, it changes the scale of the sprite. But if I was to do it this way, this would always remain relative / proportional to the text and point size that I'm using. So once I've scaled it, it doesn't matter what point size I'm using. I will always get the same relative size to my characters. So let me hit undo so I can get this thing back to what it was. Now, what if we want to add another sprite here, which is this one at index 1, and also adjust it? Well, let's do that real quick. I'm going to go here and say sprite equal, in quote, social icons, index equal 1, which is the other one. And as you can see, its position has never been adjusted, so we'll go back here. And I could certainly manually go in and do the same tweaking, but what if my sprite asset contained like 100 or 1,000 sprites? Having to adjust all of them manually would be kind of a pain. This is where this global offset and scale comes into play. So here I can say adjust all of them at 10, and then I want their vertical to be 115, and I want all their scales to be 1.25. And as you can see, it globally adjusts all of them. So let me reset everything back to 1. And now all the sprites are basically all 0 to 115 with a scale factor of 1 and whatever values I put in. So next, what I'm going to cover is I'll talk about the sort of soft coupling between the texture itself and the sprite asset, and explain why that's important and what you can do with that. As I showed earlier, the sprite asset does hold a reference to the texture that contains all the different sprites. But this is like loosely coupled, meaning TextMesh Pro actually has no clue what's actually contained in that texture. All that the sprite asset is referencing is a bunch of sprites at a specific location. Now, if the content of that texture was to change dynamically because you're pulling in content and writing into a texture at runtime, TextMesh Pro using the sprite tag would still display the new content, because all it knows is, hey, at 0,896 there's something that's 128 by 128. And to demonstrate that, what if I was to say this sprite here at index 1, what if it was like at 0? Well, as you can see, suddenly this other reference here is referencing another sprite, and I could say, well, you know what if that one was 0.5 in size? So this loose coupling allows you to do all kinds of different things, like dynamically populating the texture, or this little point that I showed here. Let me dive sort of into that real quick, which is if I go to my texture and I open up the sprite editor, whoever created this sprite asset or texture, not sprite asset, but texture, also included a large version of the sprite and a small version of the sprite. Well, if you can see, the small versions are consuming, texture space. And in reality, that's not necessary, because the sprite asset can have defined multiple versions of the same sprite with different settings. So for example, which is what I already showed, here I can have one version at that specific location that's using certain values with a certain scale, and then I can have another one that's also referencing the same texture location, but it has like different values. So this one here, I guess it's positioned right there. We could move it up if we wanted, and actually let me go put another character A behind it so we can see how it lines up with the text itself. I could say that this smaller one is going to be centered like this, right? So now I'm saving texture space and I can have as many permutations of that as I want. So the next thing I want to cover is a new feature that I added in TextMesh Pro, sort of related to this. So in the current version of TextMesh Pro, you can kind of do that, but you don't have an easy way to add and remove sprites from your sprite asset. So in the next release, you're going to have this little plus and minus sign here, which allows you to add or remove sprites from within your sprite asset. So if I was to go to the last page here and use plus, when nothing is selected, TextMesh Pro will create a duplicate of whatever the last item on the list is. So if I hit plus, now we can see that whatever this one is, it created a copy of the reference of it, and now we can basically use that and tweak it to our heart's content. But if I select one, I can actually, when I hit plus, it will make a copy of whichever one is selected. So if I hit plus here, now we made a copy of this one that's located here. The same is true if I select it and I hit minus, it removes whichever one is selected. So now you can see that in the next release, it's going to be a lot easier to add and remove sprite references inside the sprite asset. And having that ability allows you to save texture space, because now you can have the same sprite referenced multiple times with different settings. So let's go back to our page one and let me think about all the different things to make sure I've covered all the functionality that I want to cover here. So quickly I'm gonna reset this guy because I changed its value. I think it was at 128, and we'll give it back its scale of 1. The next feature, and we'll reset that to 115. So the next feature or part of the sprite tag that I want to cover that I was almost going to forget about is the following. Let me delete the next sprite here. So the sprite tag, we already covered that you can go sprite equal, this references the sprite asset itself, and we can have space name and then look up basically the sprite by name or by index. You also have, let me show the following thing. If I was to change the vertex color of the text, you will see that the sprite is not being tinted. Okay, so the sprite tag and some of the tags in TextMesh Pro can now take multiple attributes. So here I can say tint equal 0, and tint equals 0 means the sprite is not getting tinted, which is the default behavior. But if I say tint equal 1 and do this, now you can see the sprite is getting tinted based on the vertex color that's being used. And this also applies to the alpha itself. Okay. The next one I want to show is I will now remove tint. I can say sprite color equal well, that guy's already orange, so let me go for 00FF, and let's just go blah 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 FF, which basically is the same thing, and make it semi-transparent. So you now also have the ability to add a color tag that would allow you to control the color or transparency of an individual sprite. So if I was to go here and say sprite equal 0, remember here I did not specify a sprite asset. So sprite equals 0 is referencing the index, actually just to avoid confusion, sprite equal index, well no, sprite sprite space index equals 0 references the default sprite asset that's defined in our TMP settings, and this is accessing our smiley faces. So here we can see that we have one sprite who's using transparency and another one that is not. So this color and tint attribute, if I was to go here, you can see that neither of them are getting tinted. And let's go back to the one that's here and say tint equal 1. And now we'll see that, and since I had adjusted this here, now that guy is affected by vertex color, but not the other one. So now I'm pretty confident I've covered all the different aspects of the sprite asset creation process, how you can add and remove sprites from your sprite asset. I've covered all the different settings in the sprite asset in terms of the position, the offset, the scaling, the advance, and so on and so forth. I've covered the different permutations of the sprite tag itself. And I've also described or covered how the sprite asset itself has to be contained inside of a resources folder, and with the current release of TextMesh Pro and previous one, it had to be contained inside of a sprites folder that's contained inside the resources folder. But I also mentioned in the next release of TextMesh Pro, you will be able to define in the TMP settings file an alternative location for your sprite assets. So that's basically it for the video. If you have any questions or comments, or if I missed something, please let me know. And my hope is that this video will be informative and help you get the most out of your sprite assets and sprite tag in TextMesh Pro. Thank you for watching.